most scientists today would say the first humans like us, Homo sapiens sapiens, appeared less than 200,000 years ago. But the Puranas say that humans have existed for more than 200,000 years, going back perhaps hundreds of millions of years. So if what the Puranas is true, you could make a prediction that there should be reports of archaeological evidence for humans existing much further back in time than 200,000 years ago, perhaps going back many millions of years. So my methodology for testing this prediction has been to examine all archaeological reports from the time of Darwin to the present. So I divide the scientific literature into two categories, the primary and secondary scientific literature. The primary scientific literature means reports by archaeologists, geologists, paleontologists, published in their professional peer-reviewed scientific literature. Secondary literature is based on the primary literature. It would include textbooks, for example. Now, my first finding is perhaps not so surprising. There are no reports of evidence for extreme human antiquity in the current secondary literature, textbooks, for example. But my second finding is a little more interesting. There are many reports of evidence for extreme human antiquity in the primary scientific literature, past and present. And I've collected those reports in this book for Forbidden Archaeology, which is 900 pages long. Some people call it forbidding archaeology. A bit too heavy to pick up. So we brought out a shorter edition of the book called The Hidden History of the Human Race, which is available this evening. So if this evidence really is there in the primary scientific literature, the question arises, well, why don't we see it in the secondary literature, the textbooks today? And I think that's because of a process of knowledge filtration that operates in the scientific world. And that blue box represents the dominant consensus in a scientific discipline about a particular question, in this case, human origins. And this idea of a dominant consensus is related to the concept of a paradigm. Paradigm is a term that was introduced by the philosopher of science Thomas Kuhn in his important book, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions. And in that book, Kuhn said, in the absence of a paradigm, all the facts that could possibly pertain to the development of a given science are likely to seem equally relevant. But when you've got a paradigm in place, a dominant consensus about a particular question like human origins, and you have a dominant consensus that suggests humans like us are a fairly recent appearance on this planet, when you have such a consensus, when you have such a paradigm, there is some basis for scientists who are committed to that paradigm to make judgments according to their preconceptions about different categories of evidence that come to their attention. And evidence that conforms to the paradigm or the dominant consensus will pass through this intellectual filter very easily, whereas evidence that tends to contradict the ruling paradigm will be filtered out. As Kuhn said, normal science often suppresses fundamental novelties because they are subversive of its basic commitments. But anomalies can also be the foundation for new research, for new understandings, for new conclusions in the world of science. As Kuhn put it, discovery commences with the awareness of anomaly, i.e., with the recognition that nature has somehow violated the paradigm-induced expectations that govern normal science. So this book is really a collection of anomalies that challenges scientists to re-examine their paradigm. And this was recognized by some of the archaeologists who read the book. The French archaeologist Marlène Patou-Maty wrote in her review of forbidden archaeology in L'Anthropologie, Cremo and Thompson have written a provocative work that raises the problem of the influence of the dominant ideas of a time period on scientific research. These ideas can compel the researchers to orient their analyses according to the conceptions that are permitted by the scientific community. So I think it was important that a professional archaeologist realized what we were trying to do. I'm now going to give some examples of these anomalies, and some of them are going to be classic cases from the book Forbidden Archaeology, which some of you may have heard me talk about before, but there will also be some cases drawn from current research. This is Virginia Steen McIntyre. She's an American geologist. She was involved in dating an archaeological site in Mexico at a place called Hueyatlaco. There, archaeologists found stone tools and weapons of the kind that are normally attributed to Homo sapiens. It was a very professional excavation. The artifacts were photographed in the layers of rock in which they were found. The archaeologists wanted to know how old these things were, so they called a team of geologists to date the site. Virginia Steen McIntyre and her colleagues used 4 different methods to date the site. I'll mention a couple of them. In the same layer with the stone tools, animal bones with butchering marks were found. The geologists used the uranium series method to date those bones. They got an age of 245,000 years. Above the layer with the stone tools was a layer of volcanic ash. The geologists used the zircon fission track method to date that layer of ash. They got an age of 270,000 years. They got an age of 270,000 years. Using all 4 methods that they employed, the geologists concluded the age of the site must be at least 250,000 years. The archaeologists refused to accept that. According to their understanding, human beings capable of making those artifacts did not exist anywhere in the world 250,000 years ago, and what to speak of being present in North America. The dominant consensus now is that there are no humans in North America any earlier than about 20,000 years ago. So Virginia Steen McIntyre and her colleagues decided to independently publish the age for the site, which they did in this scientific journal. But when they did that, they experienced an extreme negative backlash from their colleagues in the scientific world because they had dared to publish something that radically contradicted the dominant paradigm. Virginia Steen McIntyre wrote, "Not being an anthropologist, I didn't realize how deeply woven into our thought the current theory of human evolution has become. Our work at Hueyatlaco has been rejected by most archaeologists because it contradicts that theory, period." So here's a more recent example of this knowledge filtering process. In 2013, archaeologists discovered footprints at Happisburg in the United Kingdom. The footprints were found in deposits that were between 780,000 and 1 million years old. The archaeologists very carefully studied the footprints. For example, they measured what they call the foot index, in which you divide the width by the length and multiply by 100. The average foot index for the 152 Happisburg prints was 39, which is just about the same as the foot index of living populations of anatomically modern humans. Now, of course, the archaeologists did not believe that anatomically modern humans were present in Europe almost 1 million years ago. So they decided to attribute the footprints to a hominin that they believe existed in Europe at that time, Homo antecessor. So this is one way in which the knowledge filtration process works. Scientists will interpret evidence in a way that doesn't violate their expectations. And we all have expectations that determine the way that we look at things. For example, many people will look at these cards and see nothing wrong with them, but actually they're altered, and this is part of a famous psychological experiment that was carried out. You know, the researchers took a deck of cards, a normal deck of cards, and then they altered some of the cards, like you see the 6 of spades, which normally would be black, they turned it red. So they took this deck of cards and they showed the cards to people one at a time and asked if they noticed anything. And 99% of the people did not notice anything wrong with any of the cards, even though they were altered. In other words, they saw what they were conditioned to see. They saw not what was actually in front of them, but what they expected to see. And scientists often do that. Kuhn wrote, "In science, as in the playing card experiment, novelty emerges only with difficulty, manifested by resistance against a background provided by expectation." In other words, scientists sometimes, they just do not see what is in front of them, even if it is novel, even if it is different, because they're conditioned by their expectations. And I'll give a very recent example of that. This is the OH86 finger bone, which was discovered in 2015 by archaeologists at Olduvai Gorge. It was found in a deposit 1,840,000 years old. So this finger bone is, technically it's called a left fifth proximal manual phalanx, but you can see it there circled. And the archaeologists very carefully studied this finger bone. They did measurements of it, and they compared the measurements of the OH86 finger bone to the finger bones of different species of apes, chimpanzee, gorilla, macaque, baboon, and they also compared it to the same finger bone of different hominid species like Australopithecus, Homo habilis, Homo erectus, and they found that the OH86 finger bone fit squarely in the modern human group. It was different from any kind of ape man that had previously existed, different from that of any kind of ape or monkey. So here's what the scientists said in their report, which was published in Nature Communications. OH86 represents a hominin species whose closest form affinities are to modern Homo sapiens. However, the geological age of OH86 obviously precludes its assignment to Homo sapiens. Now let me translate that for you. They're saying we've got this finger bone. It's exactly like that of modern Homo sapiens, but we cannot call it Homo sapiens because it was found in a deposit 1,860,000 years old. It's just too old. So Kuhn said about this sort of thing, no part of the aim of normal science is to call forth new sorts of phenomena. Indeed, those that will not fit the box are often not seen at all. In other words, these scientists were looking directly at this evidence, but they were not seeing it for what it really is. As far as I'm concerned, the OH86 finger bone should be assigned to Homo sapiens and be given an age of 1,840,000 years. In the 19th century, an interesting discovery was announced to the scientific world by an Argentine scientist, Florentino Ameghino. An anatomically modern human skull was found in Buenos Aires. It was found in an excavation there. The excavation went 15 meters down. There they encountered a thick layer of limestone. They broke through the limestone layer, and they found the anatomically modern human skull in the Pre-Ensenadin Formation, which according to modern geologists is between 2.15 and 3.2 million years old. So here is evidence for a modern human presence between 2 and 3 million years ago in South America. In 1999, I lectured on forbidden archaeology at the School of Geology and Geophysics at the University of Oklahoma at the invitation of geologist David Deming. And I was surprised he invited me. You know, he's a full professor there, looks totally orthodox in his views. And I asked him, why did you invite me? And he said, well, I heard you on Coast to Coast, which is a late night radio show in the United States that deals with all of these alternative topics. So sometimes it's very surprising. You know, somebody may appear to be perfectly orthodox in terms of their scientific views, but in their heart, they're harboring doubts and questions that open them up to new possibilities. So anyway, since this lecture was in Oklahoma, I thought I would mention a case from Oklahoma. There was a paleontologist early in the 20th century named Harold Cook. And in 1926, Cook learned of some discoveries of human artifacts in Oklahoma. He informed his superior, J.D. Figgins, at the Colorado Museum of Natural History, and they went to the site in Oklahoma, which is the Holloman Gravel Pit. And that's a photograph taken in January 1927 of the Holloman Gravel Pit. These are some of the artifacts that were found there. They're projectile points. They're the kind of tool that archaeologists normally say are made by humans like us. This projectile point was found at this part of the excavation, and this one here was found even a little bit deeper towards the bottom of the quarry. Now, in that same layer, which is labeled A, fossils of an extinct elephant called Trilophodon or Gomphotherium were found. It's a four-tusked elephant. And according to modern paleontology, the last appearance of Trilophodon was about 1.8 million years ago in the early Pleistocene. After that, it was extinct. And I talked to a paleontologist at the University of Oklahoma, and he said, yes, those bottom layers at the Holloman gravel pit, the fauna, the kinds of animals found there showed as early Pleistocene, which is consistent with an age of 1,800,000 years. So I would say what we've got there is evidence for a human presence in North America going back about 1.8 million years. And it's interesting what happened with David Deming. We actually went out to the Holloman gravel pit to see the place, and he became convinced that that discovery was genuine, and he began speaking about it and writing about it. It's a case where I think I was able to successfully radicalize a scientist. He wrote about this discovery. Every possible objection was raised as to why the artifacts from the Holloman pit could not be as ancient as they seemed. All objections were met and defeated. Even a vociferous critic was forced to concede that the human artifacts were of the same age as the fossil animals. So another case I've been looking into recently is the case of the deep gravel mine in Waldo, Oregon, which was owned by the Weimer brothers. This is a photograph of that gravel pit in 1906. And there was a report from a local newspaper that said the Weimer brothers in their mine near Waldo have unearthed and secured at various times a number of mortars, which are beyond question relics of a prehistoric race. They are found in the old gravel of an ancient channel 50 or 60 feet below the surface, firmly embedded in a cemented gravel near the bedrock. So I looked up some geological reports about those old cemented gravels, and the geological reports say those gravels belong to the geological period called the Tertiary. And the Tertiary begins with the Pliocene about 2.58 million years ago. So the newspaper report continued, the manner of finding these mortars precludes any possibility of mistake as to where they occur. In other words, they weren't something recent that had fallen into the gravel pit. They were firmly embedded in these ancient cemented tertiary gravels. And this is reported not just in a newspaper. A prominent geologist, J.F. Kemp, James Furman Kemp of Columbia University, learned about these discoveries, went to the place, checked it out, and wrote a scientific report in the journal Science about this. Here in England, there was an interesting discovery made by Henry Stopes, reported by him to the British Association for the Advancement of Science in 1881. The discovery was a shell with a simple but recognizable human face carved upon it. This was found in the Red Crag Formation in England, and his daughter, Mary Stopes, wrote some scientific reports also defending her father's discovery. The shell was found at a place called Walton-on-Naze on the east coast of England. And this is the Red Crag Formation at Walton-on-Naze. You can still find shells in that formation. And modern geologists say that the Red Crag Formation is late Pliocene, between 2.6 and 3 million years old. So I think we've got evidence here for a human presence going back 3 million years. In 1867, Robert Collier, a medical doctor, reported on a fossil human jaw from Suffolk, from a place called Foxhall. This anatomically modern human jawbone from Foxhall was also found in the Red Crag Formation. It's kind of close by Walton-on-Naze. And later, in the early 20th century, J. Reed Moore of the Prehistoric Society of East Anglia did further research at Foxhall. He found stone tools and weapons, signs for the deliberate use of fire. And the American anthropologist and archaeologist Henry Fairfield Osborn wrote in Natural History, "The discoveries of J. Reed Moore bring indubitable evidence of the existence of man in southeast Britain before the close of the Pliocene." So the Pliocene closes at 2.58 million years ago, and these discoveries of human bones and human artifacts go back before that. Another interesting discovery was made at a place called Miramar in Argentina. The discovery was not a human bone. This is the bone, the thigh bone of an extinct South American mammal called a toxodon. But the interesting feature of this thigh bone is it has embedded in it a flint arrowhead. This discovery was announced to the scientific world in 1915 by Carlos Ameghino. It was found in the Chapadmalalen Formation at Miramar. And according to modern geologists, the Chapadmalalen Formation is between 3.2 and 4 million years old. Of course, there were some skeptics, and they said, well, here's what probably happened. Somebody probably got a fossil toxodon bone from somewhere and then went to some fairly modern Indian village and got a flint arrowhead and then pounded it into the toxodon femur for Carlos Ameghino to find in his excavation. And so Carlos Ameghino thought, okay, if that's what they say, let me call them all to the site. So he brought a commission of the leading paleontologists and geologists and archaeologists of Argentina to the site, including the skeptics who were saying these things. And he told them, okay, you pick a place for us to dig. So they dug, and just above the man who's sitting in the center there, you can see the place where they dug several feet into the cliffside. And they found in that excavation, witnessed by all these scientists, these bola stones. Now, bola stones are a kind of weapon. You've got these stones with grooves carved around them. You attach them to strings. you can catch small animals, birds. So these kinds of instruments, according to archaeologists, are made and used only by humans like us. So we've got evidence for a human presence in the Chapadmalalen Formation going back over 3 million years in Argentina. Also at Miramar, an archaeologist named Vignati in 1921 discovered part of an anatomically modern human jaw with 2 molars embedded in it. And Dr. Joaquin Frangeli, who published a scientific report about this discovery, said, "Our attention was particularly drawn to the completely human character of the molars." And later, an American anthropologist, Theodore D. McCown, wrote, "The Miramar molars are, quote, quite positively Homo sapiens, but they were found in the Chapadmalalen Formation at Miramar, and modern geologists say that formation is between 3.2 million and 4 million years old." In 1979, Mary Leakey announced the discovery of footprints at a place called Laetoli in Tanzania in East Africa. The footprints were found in layers of solidified volcanic ash 3,700,000 years old. And in her original report, Mary Leakey said the Laetoli footprints are indistinguishable from modern human footprints. Other scientists also agreed. Paleontologist Tim White said, "Make no mistake about it, they are like modern human footprints." Now, neither Mary Leakey nor Tim White believe that humans like us existed between 3 and 4 million years ago. So how did they explain the footprints? Well, they proposed there must have been some kind of ape man, some kind of hominid who had feet exactly like modern human feet. Now, we have the skeletal remains of the hominins that existed at that time in Africa. They're varieties of Australopithecus. And the foot structure of Australopithecus is not like that of a modern human being. It has very long toes, sort of like human fingers, a first toe that can move out to the side like a human thumb. So actually, the only creature known to science from skeletal evidence that has a foot exactly like that of a modern human being is a human being like us. So what did Mary Leakey actually find? I think she found evidence that humans like us were existing in Africa almost 4 million years ago. Now, some people will say, okay, footprints are a little bit ambiguous. It would be better if you had human skeletal remains that age. And such things have been reported in the professional scientific literature. The Italian geologist Giuseppe Ragazzoni found human skeletal remains in a formation about 4 million years old at a place called Castanedolo in northern Italy. I went to Castanedolo and I met this gentleman there, and he gave me a copy of a rare geological report about these discoveries. So we relocated the place where the discoveries were made. Now, when some scientists hear that a human skeleton was found in layers of rock 4 million years old, they say this is very easy to explain. Maybe 4,000 years ago, somebody died on the surface, and then they put the skeleton down in that very ancient layer of rock, And that's why you think you've found a human, this sometimes happens when you put a PC production on a Mac. But I think you get the point that, they say, okay, it's a burial, it's an intrusive burial. The skeleton really doesn't belong in the layer in which it was found. But Ragazzoni, the discoverer, was a professional geologist, and he was very much aware of this problem. And he said, okay, if it had been a burial, then the layers of rock above the skeleton would have been disturbed, as we see here. But he looked very carefully when he was taking the skeletons out of the ground, and he could see that all the layers of rock above the skeleton were intact and undisturbed, indicating that the skeletons really were as old as the layers of rock in which they were found, in this case 4 million years old. Now, there's been a recent discovery that kind of confirms the existence of a human presence going back 4 to 5 million years or even further. And these are footprints that were discovered at a place called Trachylos in Crete. The discovery was announced this year. There were 50 footprints found. Some of them were small, 3.7 inches, but some of them were larger, 8.8 inches. This was published in the Proceedings of the Geological Association. The footprints had human-like features, short toes, the first toe larger than the others, the first toe non-divergent, in other words, in line with the others, an evident ball of the foot. But the scientists who discovered these things could not really accept that humans like us were present to make these footprints, so they suggested they must have belonged to some kind of creature like they suggested Ardipithecus ramidus, who was known to exist in Africa at about that time. But if you look at the feet of Ardipithecus ramidus, you see they don't really match those footprints that were found in Crete, which are human-like in their form. So I think the best interpretation of those footprints that were recently found in Crete is that they're evidence for a human presence 5.7 million years ago. Now, these are the waste heaps of the Ophir silver mine in Virginia City, Nevada. In the 19th century, mines were opened there for mining silver. And in the Ophir mine, this anatomically modern human skull came up. And this report says the skull was dug out about 300 feet below the surface. And then when it was brought out, it was noticed by a United States District Court judge, A.W. Baldwin, and he picked it up and saved it. And it was later sent to California, to San Francisco, to Dr. J.D. Whitney, who was the chief government geologist of California, and he studied it. And one of his colleagues, one of his associates, Dr. James Blake, made a report about it at a meeting of the California Academy of Sciences. So, as I said, this skull came from 300 feet deep in the silver deposits, which belong to the Comstock lode. And according to modern geologists, the Comstock lode deposits are of Miocene age, being about 14 million years old. Sometimes I can't even believe what I write. No, once I was giving a lecture in Eastern Europe, I think it was the Czech Republic, and I had to use a translator for my lecture. And, you know, in my slide, I had a picture of a discovery of human artifacts that were 50 million years old. So I said 50 million, but I understand enough of Czech to know that the translator said 50,000. So I had to correct him. No, not 50,000, 50 million. Things like that happen. So I think the Ophir skull provides evidence for a human presence in North America going back 14 million years. This is the Portuguese geologist Carlos Ribeiro. He discovered hundreds of human artifacts in his country of Portugal in Miocene deposits about 20 million years old. He displayed them in the Museum of Geology in Lisbon with labels indicating an early Miocene age. Today, if you go to the museum, you won't see them on display anymore. They're kept locked in the cabinets behind me, but I got permission from the directors of the museum to open up those cabinets, and I was able to study and photograph some of these 20 million year old artifacts from Portugal. Now, they're quite simple, but we have to keep in mind that there are populations of humans living today who make simple stone tools just like that. There are people in Ethiopia who make these stone tools pictured here. They use them for scraping hides. So there are humans like us living today who make simple stone tools. So just because a stone tool may seem simple doesn't mean it couldn't have been made by humans like us, because humans like us make stone tools like these that were found in Portugal even today. So I think they provide evidence that humans like us were existing 20 million years ago. So in the museum in Portugal, I also visited the archives and looked at the original maps and field notes of Dr. Ribeiro. And I went into the countryside of Portugal and I relocated some of the places where he made his discoveries, like the mine at Morganheira. Here is a flint artifact, a pointed flint artifact that he discovered there in early Miocene deposits about 20 million years old. It's interesting what happened. When Ribeiro was alive, he displayed those artifacts in the museum in Lisbon with labels showing a Miocene age of 20 million years. After he died, his colleagues in the museum did something interesting. They left the objects on display in the museum, but they wrote new labels for all of them, giving them far younger ages. This is the new label they wrote for the artifact I just showed you. The second line gives the age. It says Paleolitico Superior. That means Upper Paleolithic. Archaeologists today consider that period to go back about 20,000 years. So they thought 20 million years, that's impossible. 20,000 years, that sounds about right. So they wrote new labels for all of the artifacts. And then the next generation of officials in the museum put the entire collection away, new labels and all, and I'm the first researcher to see these things in over 50 years. Now, I presented a report about these discoveries at a meeting of the European Association of Archaeologists that was held in Lisbon. I thought that would be a good place to do it. And Later, that report was published in a peer-reviewed journal of archaeology, the Journal of Iberian Archaeology, which deals with the archaeology of Spain and Portugal. So sometimes people ask me, do you have peer-reviewed publications? And the answer is yes. So these discoveries from Portugal, as I say, they are simple, but they're about 20 million years old from the Miocene period, and some people, the mainstream archaeologists would say, well, maybe they could have been made by some kind of hominin, some kind of ape man, but there weren't any like that in Europe. And, I don't have any objection to the existence of ape men millions of years ago. The ancient Sanskrit writings speak of such creatures. They were called vanaras. They had the bodies of apes and monkeys, but human-like intelligence, and could use simple culture. And so I don't have any objection to ape men being present, hominins being present in Europe in the Miocene, but up to just recently, scientists had no evidence for the existence of hominins in Europe in the Miocene. Until just recently in Germany, some researchers found teeth, hominin teeth, from the Miocene, 9.7 million years old. They were found at a place called Eppelsheim in Germany. They're controversial, but it's a step in the right direction as far as I'm concerned. Now, some years ago, I was giving a lecture about my work in Moscow, and I met this former Russian naval officer who gave me this piece of amber. And this piece of amber was something that he found in Kaliningrad, which is near Lithuania and Poland, up there in the Baltic Sea. And the interesting feature of this piece of amber is in the circled area there. This is a magnification of it. You can see a kind of fabric there. And this is even a higher degree of magnification. You've got some kind of fiber that is woven into a fabric that is embedded in this piece of amber. Now, according to the modern scientific understanding, weaving of cloth is something that began only about 15,000 years ago in the Neolithic. But the Baltic amber is about 44 million years old. In the 19th century, gold was discovered in California. Miners went there to get it, to places like Table Mountain in the Sierra Nevada mountains. And they dug tunnels into the sides of the mountains. And deep inside the tunnels, the miners found human bones and human artifacts. They were found in layers of rock that belonged to the early part of the geological period called the Eocene, which means these things would be about 50 million years old. And here's how we arrive at that date. What you see is the bedrock there. Then above the bedrock are, at sea, are Eocene river channels full of the auriferous or gold-bearing gravel. And those deposits are between 38 million and 55 million years old. Above them are volcanic deposits between 20 and 33 million years old, and above them lava flows 9 million years old. So these discoveries were reported to the scientific world by Dr. J.D. Whitney. His report was published by Harvard University in the year 1880. And here's a description of an anatomically modern human skull fragment that was found there from a shaft in Table Mountain, 180 feet below the surface in Gold Drift. It was, in other words, it was found 180 feet inside the tunnel. A human artifact, one of many that was found there. It was found 300 feet from the mouth of the tunnel in the gold-bearing gravel. But we don't hear very much about these discoveries today because of the knowledge filtration process. This is Dr. William Holmes of the Smithsonian Institution, who said, if Dr. Whitney had understood the theory of human evolution, he wouldn't have published those discoveries. In other words, if the facts didn't support the dominant paradigm, the facts should have been cast into oblivion, and that's what happened. But some of the artifacts from the California gold mines are still in the Museum of Anthropology at the University of California at Berkeley. They're not shown to the public, but I got permission from the directors of the museum to study and photograph them. And these are some of the 50-million-year-old human artifacts from the California gold mines. They're not even kept in the museum itself. They're kept in a storage building a few miles from the museum. But this is one of them. There was an affidavit about it by Llewellyn Pierce, who said about this particular mortar, dug up by me about the year 1862 under Table Mountain in gravel at a depth of 200 feet from the surface under the basalt, which was over 60 feet deep and about 1,800 feet in from the mouth of the tunnel. J.H. Neal, the supervisor for the Montezuma mine at Table Mountain, wrote about this mortar and pestle, that it was found at a distance of between 1,400 and 1,500 feet from the mouth of the tunnel. Dr. Clarence King found this partial pestle in gold-bearing gravel at Table Mountain, and geologist George Becker said, Mr. King is perfectly sure that this instrument was in place and that it formed an original part of the gold-bearing gravels, which are about 50 million years old. So I went to Table Mountain. This is what Table Mountain looks like today. And we were able to find some of the old 19th century gold mining tunnels where these objects were originally discovered, and it should be possible to do more research there. You know, when this information was first reported, I was asked to be a consultant for a television documentary called The Mysterious Origins of Man that aired on NBC. And when scientists learned about this television program, they tried to stop NBC from showing it. They weren't successful. The program did air, but the scientists complained to the Federal Communications Commission, which is the agency of the United States government that licenses the television broadcasting companies. And they asked the government to investigate NBC, censure NBC, fine NBC millions of dollars so they would never do this again. And they wanted the government to force NBC to publicly apologize for having aired the program. Now, I'm happy to say the government didn't do that, but it was interesting that these kinds of attempts were made. I later presented a paper about these discoveries at a meeting of the World Archaeological Congress. Now, this is a pretty extreme case even for me, but you know, in 2000, a woman named Paulina Zelensky from Canada and her husband, who run a company called Advanced Digital Communications, were doing underwater research for the Cuban government, trying to locate sunken Spanish galleons off the coast of Cuba. And in their sonar search of the ocean bottom, they got images of structures on the sea bottom. And some of the imagery showed what appeared to be a city with massive stone structures. And this was found in the waters off the western tip of Cuba. And a proposal was made that these structures were erected on a land bridge that existed between Cuba and the Yucatan part of Mexico during the last ice age. During the ice ages, the water in the ocean is redeposited on the earth as ice. So that means the sea levels go down. So they thought, okay, during the ice ages, it was dry land, and that's when these structures were built. So that would be about 20, 30, 40, 50,000 years ago. But some skeptics announced, like even during the ice age, the sea levels were a maximum of 100 meters, about 328 feet lower, and these structures are found at a depth of 2,000 feet. So the skeptics proposed, okay, so these couldn't have been built during the ice age. They're at 2,000 feet, and that wouldn't have been exposed even during the time of lowered sea levels. So I thought, was there any time before that even that part of the Gulf of Mexico would have been dry land? So I did some studies in the history, the geological history of the Gulf of Mexico. And it turns out that 195 million years ago, during the Jurassic period, the Gulf of Mexico was dry land. And around that time, there were some breaks in the coast of Mexico and off the coast of Florida, and water from the Atlantic and Pacific flowed into that basin and covered what was once dry land. So, is it possible that during the Jurassic period there was a human civilization that built those structures? For me, I think it's possible. This report from the Morrisonville Times tells of a gold chain that was found in coal 300 million years old. This iron pot was found in coal deposits, again about 300 million years old. This bell was found in coal deposits about 300 million years old. And there are scientific reports of anatomically modern human skeletons being found in coal deposits about 300 million years old. This report from Scientific American tells of a beautiful metallic vase that was found 15 feet deep in solid rock near Boston. And modern geologists say the formation at that depth, at that place, is about 600 million years old. So actually, I could keep you here for many more hours going through one case after the other, because there are hundreds of these cases published in the scientific literature, the primary scientific literature.